This is wonderful. There are so many people here. There are even more online. So thank you for joining us. I'm Kay Gabriel. This event is being hosted by the People's Forum, and they have given us time and resources and amazing tech help and many chairs. So thank you to David and thank you to the People's Forum. Really appreciate it. David, if there's anything else that I should shout out, let me know. Amazing, great. Okay, so welcome to Organizing Lessons from ACT UP in conversation with Sarah Schulman, who is our guest tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about the event. I'm going to ask some people who helped organize the event to talk about the thing that they do. I'm going to introduce Sarah, and we're going to talk. Are we? And Zoe is handling the Zoom, and is going to. Amazing, great. This is an on-the-fly decision, but can we record? Great. Can you do amazing? Let's do that. People object. Just let me know. But I think we should. I would rather record it. Okay. So, gosh, what do I have to tell you? So this is an event put on by the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. Biggest chapter of DSA. Most of you are DSA members. I don't need to tell you about it. But I really wanted to put on an event about ACT UP, drawing on the history that Sarah's written about in this book, which we'll get to in a second, for those of us in DSA to think about and to learn about the organizing history from the AIDS rebellion. This event was put together by, among other people, the fantastic organizers from DSA's Queer Caucus and also from the Healthcare Working Group. So thank you. And I'm just going to ask Elliot and Natalie to talk about Queer Caucus. And if you are from the Healthcare Working Group and you want to talk about what you guys have going on, let me know or flag us down in the chat in the Zoom.
Welcome. Thanks for coming. I'm Natalie, she, her pronouns. I'm on the organizing committee of the New York City-DSA Queer Caucus. So a little bit about, the caucus. We've been around for a few years. We seek to provide community and as well as, organizing opportunities for LGBTQ plus individuals within New York City-DSA. And, basically, we were a core group in terms of the Queer Liberation March, basically. The first meetings of that, organizing project came out of our group meetings and so forth, and we remain involved in that. That was an alternate protest march in contrast to the corporate mess that we see at Pride every year. And in the first year, we managed to mobilize 45,000 people to march for queer liberation and against rainbow capitalism. That is a motto of our group. We have some palm cards that are going around, but Elliot's going to speak more about the work we're doing now as well as how to get involved.
Hey everyone, I'm Elliot. I use they, them pronouns. I'm in the Central Brooklyn branch. And so, we would love for you all to get involved in the New York City DSA Queer Caucus. We meet once a month over Zoom, and we usually read stuff and discuss current events. We also have social events in person when we can. It's a really great space just to gather with other queer and trans comrades within DSA. And our next meeting is on February 15th. It's a Tuesday at 7 p.m. If you'd like to get more details about that meeting or about the caucus in general, please join our mailing list. I'll send this clipboard around. Our meetings are on the third Tuesday of every month at 7 p.m. over Zoom. And we, like I said, as often as we can, try to do in-person social events as well. So please sign up for the mailing list, and we hope to see you at a meeting soon. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Amazing. Cool. So if there's anyone here from the Healthcare Working Group, flag me down or flag us down in the chat. If not, you will have a chance to talk about everything that you guys have going on later. And in the meantime, thank you. Okay, so let's get started. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce Sarah Schulman, our guest tonight. Yes, yeah, you can clap. You can clap. Please clap. Sarah is a friend and a mentor, and someone whose work I have found extremely transformational in my life and my understanding of the world. She is the author of 20 books. Just like let that sink in. And that includes fiction and nonfiction and plays. In the 1980s, Sarah was a reporter. She was a rank and file member of ACT UP. And then you started the Lesbian Avengers in 1993? 1992. Amazing. Lesbian Avengers, which, among other things, helped to protest Mishfest, right, over their trans exclusionary attendance policy. So, which is to say, there's like a deep and long-term organizing, let's say, trajectory here that I think will be interesting maybe to touch on. In 2001, you started the ACT UP Oral History Project with Jim Hubbard, which over the course of which Sarah and Jim interviewed 192 former and current, or then current members of ACT UP New York. That oral history project is free and accessible online. Anyone can go and look at it, and I really suggest that you do. It's rewarding. In 2011, Sarah and Jim released United in Anger, which is a documentary that came out of the oral history project. I showed it to my students last term, and they were transfixed. I've never seen 18-year-olds pay as much attention to something, ever. So that's cool. And then most recently, and the reason why we're gathered here tonight, or one of the reasons why we're gathered here tonight, is that Sarah wrote, out of the Oral History Project again, Sarah wrote this book, Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP New York, from 87 to 93. Yes, it is a doorstop. Yes, every page is worth reading. I really hope that you find the time to do so. I think that is everything that I want to say by way of introduction. So Sarah, welcome once more, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here and to meet you all.
I'm going... pages backwards. Okay, so the way that tonight is going to go is I'm going to ask Sarah some questions. I'm going to open it up for audience questions like pretty soon afterwards. And then we're going to get questions from the Zoom as well. So if you have a question, you should feel free to drop it in the chat. And our Zoom moderators, Zoe and Natalie, will read it out. But just to start, so you and Jim Hubbard started the ACT UP Oral History Project in 2001. 2011, you released United in Anger. And then in 2017, you began working on this book?
Yeah.
So why this intervention and why now?
Okay, well, it actually starts much earlier. So in 1979, I dropped out of college and came back to New York, and I became a grassroots reporter in the queer and feminist community. So at that time, there was absolutely no coverage in corporate media of queer people, of feminism, of any of the movements that were going on at the time. And there was a league of intrepid grassroots journalists like myself who worked for free and had no training, but were out there identifying what were the issues for our community and solidifying what was going on. And so I worked for 3 papers, primarily Woman News, which was the straight and gay feminist newspaper, Gay Community News, which was the Socialists, gay and lesbian paper, and later the New York Native, which was the gay male newspaper. And I think all of these are digitized now. So the issue at the time, so I started before Reagan was elected, but the issue at the time was that there was no gay rights bill in New York City. And that's what I was basically covering, as well as the rise of what we called the New Right, which was the bringing evangelicals into the Republican Party, which was occurring at that time. And then in 1981, science observed the pattern that came to be known as AIDS. We now know that AIDS has existed for about 100 years, but science didn't notice it until 1981. And the first article, the first public statement was the New York Times, July 3rd, 1981, 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals in San Francisco. So since I was already on the beat, I started covering AIDS at that point. And in those first few years, the first 5 or 6 years of the epidemic, which was a period in which 40,000 people died, and the government and pharma did absolutely nothing, I covered mostly from a social justice lens. So I reported on pediatric AIDS, women being excluded from experimental drug trials, later homeless people with AIDS, but I also covered the closing of the bathhouses when the health department shut down the gay male bathhouses. And that's kind of an interesting assignment since women were not allowed in the bathhouses. I had never been to a bathhouse, but everything was so chaotic. You know, the mainstream media covered nothing. We had to cover everything, and journalists were dying and editors were dying, and it was very chaotic, and they were like, send that girl to the bathhouses, and off I went. Okay. So then ACT UP was founded after, so I just think that, just to give you the history, one of the key events was 1986, the Supreme Court upheld Bowers v. Hardwick, which was the sodomy laws. And this was an incredible slap in the face. I mean, we were in the middle of a mass death experience, and here was the Supreme Court, ever irrelevant, saying that gay sex should continue to be illegal, which it was until 2003, which is when the Supreme Court finally overturned that. So this created a more politicized environment, and ACT UP was founded in March 10th, 1987, and I joined in July 1987. And I stayed until about 1992, 1993. And ACT UP had a split in 92, and it was a very depressing time. We were not making progress medically, and a lot of the leadership was dying, and the organization kind of dissipated, even though it still exists to this day. The timeline is that 96 were the protease inhibitors. Those were the drugs that worked. That's when they became available. And then 99 is the internet revolution. Now, all of this was a pre-internet movement. And so in 99, if you searched ACT UP, you would have found nothing, because none of our material was digitized. So in 2001, and then this is where the next wave of interventions begin, I was driving in a car in LA trying to sell something to Hollywood. By the way, I failed. And it was the 20th anniversary of AIDS, which we now know is the 20th anniversary of noticing AIDS. And the announcer said, you know, at first America had trouble with people with AIDS, but then they came around. And I really almost crashed the car. I thought, oh no, this is going to be a nightmare. You know, this is going to be this whole historicization where they claim how benevolent they are and how good they are, and when actually thousands of people fought until the day they died and forced the country to change against its will. So I pulled the car over and I called Jim Hubbard, who was my collaborator, he's a filmmaker, and we realized that we had to create digitized data. So we started with the support of Urvashi Vad. We started the ACT UP Oral History Project in 2001, and we interviewed 188 people over the next 18 years. We made everything available open access. So if you go to the website today, you can watch all the videos. We have a whole section of archive on the Latino Caucus. You can see everything. We made everything available for free. We've had over 14 million hits. So then we decided we wanted to do a film. And we had some trouble getting film money. Am I going on too long here? Oh, okay. Okay. This is kind of interesting, actually. So we had all this Jim had preserved about 2,000 hours of archival footage, because at the beginning of AIDS, the operative form was film. It was still 16 millimeter and Super 8 film, and people were literally pointing movie cameras at TV screens and filming them, because there was no technology for recording off a television set. But then the camcorder was invented, right? So ACT UP became the first movement that had video activism, and we decided we wanted to make a film. So we went to the film funders, and they were like, a documentary is the story of 5 people on a journey. We were like, well, we can't do that, because this is actually the story of a huge group and a broad coalition, and they're like, no. And we couldn't get any film money. So it took us 10 years to get the film made. And by the time we got it made, another film had come out, and I won't say the name of it, that basically gave the impression that it was a handful of white individuals who had created the paradigm shift that was won by AIDS activism. And not only is that completely inaccurate, it's also impossible, because that's not how things work. You know, there is this myth of John Wayne in America, right, that the white heroic individual male comes in and saves the day, but actually that never happens. And you know, movements are forced to push their narratives into those frames, but they're counterproductive. So that was very disturbing, and all of a sudden Jim and I realized that somebody had to write what actually happened, and that if we didn't, it was never be done. And this is, you know, Jim and I have been motivated by our dead friends, basically, you know, our responsibilities towards them. And so I realized I was going to have to do this book, and I sat down in 3 years and I wrote it. So at every point, it's an intervention, you know, along the way. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that you say in here is that the win obscured the process, right? And I think those of us who grew up in a world, like our kind of first awareness of HIV/AIDS was in a world that already had protease inhibitors. That's not everyone in this audience, but it's some of us, right? And from that perspective, there's like this very easy understanding of like, oh, well, you know, we won, it's fine. But the world that you begin, in the world that is kind of at the start of this book, politicians were openly speculating about putting people with AIDS into camps. And not like that. This is something that is like it's not like conceivable now. Nobody would say that, right? But people were saying it at the time. So there's something in this process, which is like about in the process of like writing about doing the oral history project and the film and then the book, that it resuscitates what it was like to live that moment. I have a question about the organization itself. So I think a lot of people here are probably relatively familiar with ACT UP and the moment of the HIV/AIDS crisis that it was responding to. But for those who aren't, can you summarize what the organization was and how people made decisions and how those organizational practices responded to the crisis?
Okay, so just to say what politics was like before ACT UP, so you can get the context a little bit. So let me just say that the autonomous gay and lesbian movement, as it was known then, or the gay movement as it was known, the reason there was a queer movement at the time was because the left did not want us. It's not because people theorized, oh, we need an autonomous queer movement. So the Communist Party had expelled homosexuals, and there's a book that's going to come out by Bettina Aptheker about this. That's the civil rights movement famously sidelined Bayard Rustin. The feminist movement had a number of lesbian purges, some of which have not yet been historicized. And so we were forced into this movement. So I think you need to start with that image. And there were people in the gay movement who had been in lots of other movements, but usually they were in the closet. So they didn't have that presence, but they did have that political experience. So I also want to start by saying that right now, white gay male is like a privileged category, but in 1981, it was a profoundly oppressed minority. And just to give you you understand where we were coming from. So gay sex was illegal. There was no gay rights bill in New York City. You could get fired from your job or kicked out of an apartment. You could be denied public accommodation, which happened to me twice. You could be thrown out of a restaurant for kissing another woman over dinner. The waitress came and said, "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to leave." And we had to leave. You could be denied a hotel. Familial homophobia was the norm, and it was virulent. And street violence, which was called gay bashing, was like a form of entertainment. And police violence was common. So you're talking about people who really had no rights. And in those first few years, the gay community tried to create some facsimile of social services. And I want to say that familial homophobia is a great force of history that has been underestimated. But, you know, because of it, a lot of people did not have any family network or support. So there were buddy systems, there were people who would walk your dog, there was God's Love We Deliver that would bring meals. But it didn't become political until after Bowers v. Hardwick and then ACT UP. So ACT UP is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. It was a direct action group. It had a one-line statement of unity, direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And that was in contrast to social services. That's what that meant. And basically, if you were doing direct action to end the AIDS crisis, basically you could do whatever you wanted. It was not a consensus-based organization. So, for example, and it had a very, very broad constituency. And different constituencies in ACT UP had very different material experiences of being a person with HIV in New York City. So there were some very elite people. There were people who were homeless. There were drug users, active and former IV drug users. There were women with AIDS who could not get benefits or get into experimental drug trials. Women were excluded at the time. So there were people in ACT UP who were having very different experiences. And so because people with AIDS were the experts, that was the concept. And everything that ACT UP did was based on the needs and perspective of people with AIDS. So this loose structure, this kind of radical democracy, enabled people to do whatever kinds of actions they needed to do based on what their own experiences were. So for example, needle exchange was illegal in New York City, and at the time the prevalent theory was abstinence. But ACT UP favored this new idea, which was harm reduction. And that was controversial. There were a lot of people in ACT UP who did not support harm reduction. The mayor, we had a black mayor at the time, David Dinkins, and he opposed needle exchange. So if you wanted to work on needle exchange and I didn't want to, I would argue with you because we were pre-gentrification New Yorkers and we screamed at each other, and we still scream at each other. But in the end, I would not try to stop you from doing it. I just wouldn't do it. If I didn't agree with it, I wouldn't do it. And I would go find other people who wanted to do what I wanted to do, and we would do that. And this radical democracy structure enabled so many different kinds of reactions at the same time. So many different kinds of campaigns done differently with different aesthetics, aimed at different social milieu, that this simultaneity of action is really what created the paradigm shift. And I want to say that historically, I think it's accurate to say, I'm going to make a claim, you can argue with me, that no movement that has tried to force people to agree on one analysis or one strategy has ever succeeded. And it's for very human reasons. People can only be where they're at, and that's just the way it is. And real leadership facilitates people being effective from wherever they're at. You know, so that I think is the biggest takeaway.
That gets like. So I think that's a fascinating claim. I am sympathetic to it. I'm curious if anyone is gonna challenge it. But I mean I find that quite persuasive, I guess, for two reasons. One is that it strikes me that one thing that you're interested in the book is effectiveness, right? And you say at some point that. You say that social change happens because of small groups of people, only some of whom are committed to being effective. So there's effectiveness on the one hand, and then there's kind of disagreement and conflict on the other. And it strikes me that, you know, one of the things that you talk about is how ACT UP was able to be effective and the different senses of that efficacy. And then you also give a really rich sense of the ways that people were able to disagree and to kind of be in conflict or, let's say, like productive struggle together. And I'm wondering if you can talk about like both of those things, both efficacy and disagreement.
Okay, because the disagreement only worked for a while. ACT UP did split in 1992, right? So, all right, so let me just say that I think that your social position determines your strategy, and that different people need different strategies. And I'm going to give an example of 3 different sectors that were in ACT UP together who had different approaches. So as I said, there was a small group of very elite people who like went to Harvard and were stockbrokers and came from rich families and all of that. And they turned out to be very, very effective at talking to pharmaceutical companies and government. Because at this time, we're talking about the 1980s, the government was basically white and male. The media was basically white and male, and the private sector was white and male. Even me as a white lesbian, there was no one like me in power. You know, there was no Rachel Maddow or whatever, right? So when these guys, so Larry Kramer, who was the catalyst for the first meetings of ACT UP, he went to Yale with the head of Bristol Myers Pharmaceutical Company. You know, so he could get a meeting. And then they would have meetings with these really smart guys who were just like them, the guys from ACT UP who were just like those guys. And, you know, there were stories of them getting like a catered lunch at a pharmaceutical company. But they were very effective, these guys. And they are part of the reason that ACT UP was effective. However, take a look at women with HIV. Now, in the 1960s, there was a drug called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women, thousands of whom had children who were born without limbs. And they sued pharma. Pharma had to pay out all these settlements, and so pharma decided no more women in experimental drug trials. So when AIDS came along, women could not get in the trials. Now, at those days, there were no treatments, so trials were the only treatments. And women with AIDS tended to be poorer, tended to be often women of color, and certainly got diagnosed much later in the progression of their disease because they didn't have health care. So denying people access to trials meant that they were going to die. The second thing was that the government defined AIDS based on gay male symptoms, and women had symptoms that men did not have. And those symptoms were not on the list, and they couldn't qualify for benefits. So you have the poorest people who can't get treatment and can't get benefits. ACT UP ran a 4-year campaign that was multifaceted. There was a lawsuit against Social Security. There were all kinds of very messy actions about screaming at people and handcuffing yourself to government people and breaking into people's offices and yelling at people in airports and all kinds of stuff. And it went on for 4 years, and ACT UP was successful. And in many ways, this was the greatest victory for women and poor people in the history of HIV. Interesting that it came from a predominantly white male, gay male organization. Okay, so then you have the third sector, IV drug users. You know, so because of the situation with needle exchange, they took a very high-risk strategy. They deliberately, illegally exchanged needles in order to get arrested, to have a test case, and they actually won, but imagine if they had lost. And that made needle exchange legal in New York City. So there you have 3 different groups in the same organization who chose different strategies based on their social position. And you need an organizational structure that allows for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we can think now as well about like New York City just opened last November a safe injection site. Which might be like that plus universal pre-K might be like the only 2 good things that de Blasio gave us. Maybe not. Maybe there's more. But so in a real sense, we're like, as in many other senses, we are living in a world that some of these organizational wins made possible. Which is really interesting to experience. I want to circle back on the question about disagreement. So the split happened. I actually wasn't going to bring up the split because I kind of imagine that a lot of questions that you get about ACT UP really focus on the split. And which, like, for good reason, because it sounds like people experienced it as like a very politically destabilizing and emotionally saddening or chaotic, maybe both of those things, event. And so I mean, I'd be curious to for you to talk about it more if you want to, but also it happened 5 years after the organization started, and it went through many conflicts before that point and was able to be effective before that point. So I'm wondering, I think it's I will sort of say this for DSA folks as like famously we are a big tent organization in which like we have like a platform that a lot of people from a lot of different tendencies, a lot of different political tendencies like poured a lot of work into, and it is an organization in which we deliberate on things and we vote on things, but it is an organization that also allows for a great degree of disagreement, and sometimes manages that conflict. I think, my assessment, manages that conflict well, and sometimes doesn't, right? But I'm curious if maybe, as we sort of like think about, we research around in history, we look at examples. I'm curious if you can talk about how people worked through disagreement and came to shared decisions.
Well, one, I think, good example is Stop the Church. So this was a demonstration in December of 1989. So you have to go back. This is the Catholic Church before the priest-sex scandal. This is when they were at the top of their power, and the cardinal had more power than the mayor and was in office longer. Okay, and normally the Catholic Church stayed in their lane with Catholic schools, but at this point, there was a push to have condom distribution in the public schools. And so the Catholic Church started getting their people on the public school boards. So they exchanged lanes to try to stop this condom distribution. And ACT UP people felt that people would die because of this policy. And we really had to look at ourselves. There had been this respect of religious institutions for many years. The abortion issue had been pushed aside many times in left-wing coalitions with the Catholic Church, especially around they were very active in El Salvador, and there was a left-wing branch of the Catholic Church that was anti-abortion. And, people had had their needs pushed aside in the past. And there was a psychological leap that had to be made. So ACT UP decided that we were going to disrupt Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in December 1989. Now, ACT UP was mostly a Jewish and Catholic organization, but there were Protestants in ACT UP, and I think, this is my assessment, but I think that among the Protestants, some were very concerned about ACT UP being seen as an anti-Catholic organization. The Jews and the Catholics did not care about that. Okay. But so in the debates about how to run this action, the negotiation was that we decided we would do a silent die-in during the homily. This was the plan. So we all go in there. There was a demonstration outside of 7,000 people, which was ACT UP's largest demonstration. And a whole bunch of us go inside the church. I was in there. And the idea was that we were going to do a silent die-in. Okay, so Cardinal O'Connor is doing his thing, and some people start lying in the pews and all of this. And then this member of ACT UP named Michael Petrellis, he jumps up on the pew and he blows a whistle. And he starts yelling at O'Connor, "You're killing us, you're killing us, stop it." Then his New York accent, "Stop it, stop it." And O'Connor, we have footage of O'Connor going like this. And then there's total chaos and everyone's screaming and people are throwing things and the police come and 100 people get arrested and all this kind of thing. And I thought it was the worst thing that ever happened in the world. I was devastated, I thought it was terrible. Anyway, I was wrong, by the way. It turned out to be one of our greatest actions. It was on the front page of every newspaper in the world. It was homosexuals with AIDS disrupt Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. And, Larry Kramer always said that it was the turning point because that's when people became afraid of us because we were not predictable. But at any rate, we had after each action, we would have a post-action meeting, and everybody came, and people were very angry at Michael, right, because he had gone against the group. However, interestingly, no one ever suggested throwing him out. In fact, no one was ever thrown out of ACT UP except for this cult called the New Alliance Party, who were trying to take over the organization. But no individual was ever thrown out. And I really think it was because we didn't have supremacy ideology about ourselves. We were a community. We were on the bottom. We were dropping dead. Nobody cared. We had no rights. We didn't have the concept of throwing people out. A community was not something that you could throw people out of. And so people were just mad at him, and that was that. And then it all turned out for the best. But I think that there was a lot of acting out and act up. One guy stole $10,000. There was quite a few people screamed at each other. It was terrible. People were dying in front of you. And AIDS death is a terrible death. I mean, people went blind and demented and couldn't control their diarrhea. And, I was only 23 when AIDS started. And it was horrible sometimes in there. And people acted out, and we understood that. It was just because everybody was suffering. So why weren't they crying and screaming and acting crazy? It made sense in a way. So there was that compassion as well. So I think that that's an example of working through a conflict.
Right. I mean, that's so interesting, right? Because it's like, it's a really interesting example because the person who went against what everyone had not only just sort of stated as their desired course of action, but it actually voted on, caused a series of reactions that allowed, in kind of your estimation and in Larry Kramer's estimation, caused this action to be much more effective than it would have been otherwise. Which I think is an interesting example about, in a sense, humility. We come to an assessment of what we think the right thing is, and then actually we might be totally wrong, and actually that also might be okay. So that is a kind of, let's say, that's a lesson that I take to heart. Can I get a time check? Because I don't have a timepiece up here. Okay, cool. I want to ask one more question, and then I think we should do audience questions. You've argued that people only join organizations when those organizations make their lives better. In addition to the large-scale wins that changed people's lives, and we've talked about what some of those are, what are some everyday ways that ACT UP made better the lives of people who were part of the organization?
Oh, so many ways. Well, because when AIDS first happened, people were afraid to have sex. I mean, the bathhouses were closed. Everyone was terrified they were going to die. And ACT UP was a place that, in the beginning, everyone did use condoms. I mean, in my interviews, I asked people about this. And you have to remember that in the early days, a lot of people did not get tested because there were no treatments. So if people thought, if I don't have symptoms, why should I get tested? I'll just be miserable if I find out I'm HIV positive. So people didn't know what their status was. And it was such a tight community in a way. I mean, even now, when I see someone on the street who I know was in ACT UP and I don't even know their name, we are very warm with each other. We're bonded for life because we changed the world, and very few people can have that experience. And so it was a very sexual environment in ACT UP, and it was a bisexual environment as well. So that made people's lives better because everyone was young, And then, people partied. I mean, this is before the crystal meth thing, so it was the old kind of drugs that didn't take over your whole life. So there was a lot of partying and sex, and people lived together, and there were a lot of people who were more marginal financially. People gave up their jobs or dropped out of school to work in ACT UP. People worked as temps. So there was just a lot of camaraderie, and it was fascinating. I mean, there were no official spokespeople for the organization. Any person in ACT UP could talk to the media. So we had these teach-ins all the time. And the average person was very, very sophisticated in terms of their knowledge of the issues. Before every action, we had big teach-ins, and people really knew what they were talking about. So that was fascinating, and figuring out how to change things was fascinating. And all the different strategies that we tried, and all the different campaigns that we ran. So it was fun, and and we all learned a lot. And for many, many people, it was the best time in their life, because they really had an impact.
Wow, yeah. I mean, there's something that's so monumental, I think, in thinking this is an organization that is making your life better because you're a part of it and because of what it's able to do. And both of those things happening at the same time. And then they feed into each other because people are going to keep coming back to and giving their time and labor and doing really boring, annoying stuff, or dangerous stuff or or like risky stuff for an organization that they believe in and that they think is going to like change the course of their life.
But also it's pre-marriage gay culture, right? So it's the early gay male sexual culture. So there's a lot of sex all the time. And that's a real motive for going to really boring meetings. Because there's an afterlife.
Is that an organizing lesson? One more question, and then I want to turn it over to people. At some point in the book, you talk about a party that happened at Henrietta Hudson's that Maxine Wolf gave you shit over because people weren't using dental dams or something. I'm just curious. The question.
No, that was the wrong bar. There used to be a women's back room bar on 6th Street. I forget the name of the bar now. Now it's called Club Cummings, right? It's Alan Cummings Club.
Wow.
But it used to be a women's back room. And so, AIDS hysteria is a real fact. And it's a fact now. And it certainly was a fact in ACT UP. Because you're around people all the time, and a lot of guys felt like it was inevitable that they were going to get AIDS, and if they got it, they were going to die. And for the women, some of them were having sex with men, or some of them who weren't were with men all the time who were really, really sick. And there was always a fear that you could get infected even if you couldn't, and all of this. And from that emerged, I believe, a lot of mythology about female-to-female transmission, which I believe does not exist. And I at the time, there were about 6 or 7 cases of women who claimed that they had gotten HIV infected from another woman. But when you read when I read the cases at the time, there were also like sex work and needles lurking in each picture. And actually, female to male transmission really didn't exist in North America either. And later, WHO in the UN discovered that it had to do with circumcision because foreskin tears made people vulnerable to CD4 cells. So in places where most men or many men are circumcised, female-to-male transmission is almost impossible. And we didn't really understand that at the time. But there was a lot of persecution of female sex workers who had male clients because the concept was that they were going to infect the John who was going to bring it home to his family. It's always like women are the vector of infection. Women are never the person with AIDS who needs services. But actually, it was the woman who was in danger of being infected by the man. But when I think back on it, I realize that if we had really known that female-to-male transmission did not exist here, then we never would have been able to get men to use condoms. So the fact that men thought they could get infected, even if they couldn't, was the only thing that protected women, actually.
Wow. Fascinating.
Yeah.
I could go on, but this is not my party, it's our party. So I guess maybe the way that we'll do this is if you have a question, just put your hand up. I will come up here. I will hand you the mic. If you are the Zoom audience, hi. You can pop your question in the chat, and then Natalie or Zoe will ask it for you. Cool. Yeah. So as we say, a stack is open. Please, in the front row.
Thank you. This is fascinating, and I love the book. We're living with the disease again, with very different characteristics, and there's a cacophony of voices about what's going on and how we should respond to it. But there's also some social mobilization taking place around it, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about where that's going and what it means. I was just watching something about the Canadian truckers' strike against forced mandate for vaccines. I just thought, could you bring it up to date, and do you have any thoughts on all of that?
I have some weird thoughts. I don't think they're exactly what you're looking for, but I mean, what kills me is once we had drugs that worked, people couldn't get them because although we had, in a sense, defeated HIV, we didn't defeat capitalism. And so the greed of pharmaceutical companies kept these drugs from being available. And even today, there was an article in the New York Times by Linda Villarosa just a few years ago saying that black gay men in the U.S. South had higher rates of HIV infection than any country in the world, right? So then when I'm watching the COVID vaccines and I see that poor countries can't get vaccines that exist for the exact same reason, it's so infuriating. And I think it really shows us that it's not just about national health care, we need international health care. We need a global health care system where every person on earth can get access to the standard of care. Because, borders have become these places of enormous violence. We have more refugees in the world than we've ever had. And, nationalism is only a negative force. And and pandemics prove that we have to think internationally. On the other hand, what's really different is that COVID is a collective public experience. It's discussed all the time. It's on TV and all of that. AIDS was like our private nightmare, and our fight was to get it into the public. And, that's a very, very big difference.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the Vito Russo speech where he said having AIDS is like being in a war where only the people you know are dying, and then everyone else, it's just not happening to them. Other questions? Yes, please.
I'll go ahead and
Yeah, so we have a mic to run to people. So let's do Paul and then Ceci.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, and then who's somebody back there? Okay, actually, yeah.
Back here? Okay.
Back there, and then you guys.
Okay.
Hi, I wanted to know how you guys would pick targets for handcuffing yourselves or yelling at airports, like you mentioned. Who are the high value targets?
Okay, so things were organized based on campaign structure. So the concept was that people with AIDS know what the problems are. So they know what they need. So you look at the thing that you need and you design the solution. What you want to avoid is being in an infantilized relationship to power where you're begging the people in power to solve the problem, because they will never solve it and they don't want to and they don't know how. So you design a reasonable, winnable, and doable solution. Then you present it to the powers that be. When they refuse, that's when you do nonviolent civil disobedience, but in a manner that's so theatrical that you can get media time so that you communicate through the media to the public what the problem is and what your solution is. And in this way, every action that you do or every target is part of a campaign of pressure towards a particular power center to get your solution in place. What you don't want to do is to organize one-offs where you're just wasting people's energy. Each action should lead to another action so that you're in a campaign structure.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can discuss a bit it relates to the split, but it's not exactly on the split. From the get-go, ACT UP was very militant tactically, willing to get arrested and all the theatrics that you just alluded to. But within the organization, some had a more radical vision in terms of policy and solutions that underlying AIDS and the lack of action on AIDS was homophobia and capitalism, and that would impact how the solutions might get delivered or not delivered. But not everybody in the organization had that radical understanding of the context of AIDS, right? And so how did that evolve, and what was that experientially for your observations on that disjunction between radicalism about tactics, but sometimes a narrow policy or political understanding?
Okay, so this is retrospect, and I want to say, I know more cumulatively about ACT UP than anyone at that time knew at the time. We didn't have the internet, right? So the only way you knew something is if somebody told you. So if you went to a meeting and you heard someone tell you something, then you knew it. But nobody really knew what everyone else was doing. And even when we interviewed people nobody had an organizational overview. So now that I have it, I can answer your question. But at the time, nobody would have known the answer, okay? So basically, there were two tendencies. So one was the drugs into bodies, the treatment activists, the people who were trying to get pharma and the government to change the way they researched drugs and made drugs available to try to get treatments that worked. And they were on that. And then there were the access people. And those are the people who were like, we started Housing Works, started an ACT UP, for example. So housing for homeless people with AIDS. There was a Haitian Underground Railroad trying to get housing for Haitians who were incarcerated in Guantanamo because they were HIV positive. There were people working with incarcerated women with HIV. You know, it was like working with poor people, basically. And that was and people really kind of did one or the other, even though at the time you didn't really understand that that's what was happening. But that's kind of how it broke down. But because of the structure, you could function that way. So people didn't really argue with each other about which way was best until they finally came into conflict, and that was sort of the downfall.
Hi there. So your comment about the opposition to harm reduction within the organization was very interesting, just because ACT UP, is I'm very much within the harm reduction movement here, and it very much is kind of heralded as our like kind of forefather. It's very valorized, so I found that surprising. And I mean, but it's also not surprising. Just to be a little self-reflective as DSA members here. I helped found the Socialist Drug Politics Organizing Committee, which is focusing on bringing socialism to harm reduction and to drug politics. And we were totally shut down by one of the committees hosting the event, no shade. But, and I don't know, it just struck me too, like how you said in ACT UP, like if it's not your thing, it's not your thing. You do your thing, we'll do our thing, but you're still welcome here. We're a community. Whereas the committee that we were proposing to join was like, we're a single issue group where we're focusing on the New York Health Act, which is, single payer healthcare in New York. And that like you basically don't fit within our vision, and, you'll be taking up manpower, even though, we were just saying like, just give us like an institutional home. Like we aren't asking for your manpower. So I guess that's just something maybe for us all to think about as DSAers, like maybe we should be taking these lessons from ACT UP into our own organization. But then I guess as like an actual, sorry for taking that air time just to say that, but as an actual question for you, I'm curious more about like, that opposition to harm reduction within ACT UP. And I'm also curious, just as someone who's familiar with this history, the lack of thinking around people who were using crack cocaine at the time, and how that hysteria, was kind of converging with the AIDS crisis, and specifically when it comes to Black women who were living with AIDS, many of whom, were also using crack for various reasons, and just how, from my understanding, that seemed to elude the group, and how generally the harm reductionists in the US at the time were not doing a very good job at working to destigmatize crack and actually provide the services that people who were using crack needed.
Interesting. Okay, so I mean, my understanding is that the focus was on needles, because needles were a mode of transmission and crack was not a mode of transmission. Am I wrong?
It was. One of the big drivers of HIV among women, specifically sex workers, was crack. And I mean, it wasn't, there's like a very small chance you could get Hep C from like sharing crack pipes if like your lips are bloody and stuff. But it was mostly the sex that and the like lower of inhibitions that was associated with crack cocaine.
Well, that's a totally different conversation, because that's a conversation we did have in ACT UP. So one of the interesting things was people would get high and then they would have unsafe sex, right? But at a certain point, I remember Maxine Wolf actually saying, you know what? People are getting high so that they can have unsafe sex. And that was a completely different understanding. That was important. That was a revelation within the group. So let me just say that harm reduction was a brand new idea. And so people who used drugs were excluded from treatment. There's a famous confrontation between Richard Elovich, who was a former IV drug user in ACT UP, with Fauci, who was in power at the time. And Richard was like, how come you're not enrolling drug users in experimental drug trials? And Fauci was like, they're not reliable. And Richard was like, you cannot write off an entire class of people. So that was a confrontation with the government, and the issue was that we were focused on was transmission through needles. But it was hard for people who were more bourgeois and had never been around needles to grasp the thing about harm reduction. And so I think there was just a a cultural miss, but they didn't say you can't do it. It just said that wasn't their thing. Now I think we all know that harm reduction is correct and that it's effective, but at the time it was unclear. And also it was not popular in the Black community in New York, harm reduction, yeah.
The loudest voices in the Black community.
Pardon me?
I would say the loudest voices within the Black community, but I mean, there are many Black harm reductionists.
Well, I mean, I go into it a little bit. There were some meetings between Black organizations and ACT UP about needle exchange, and I mentioned some of it. But there's more. If you go into the Oral History Project, you can get more detail.
This is super fascinating. So, Ceci, thank you for bringing that up. The one thing about harm reduction that actually comes to mind now is like, it's phenomenal that it's like a principle that people have taken on board, but when faced with COVID and people making different choices based on like often like what are you doing with like leisure or like sex or like in your free time, there's a lot of moralism that still seems to infect so to speak. That's a bad metaphor here. There's a lot of moralism that seems to characterize how people address each other's behavior, which is interesting because at least one lesson, the two pandemics cannot be mapped onto each other. I think that we've all learned that. But one lesson that the AIDS epidemic would seem to teach us is that if you moralize that people about their individual behavior, they will not change their behavior. And they won't change their behavior to do something that even in aggregate is safer. They'll just stop telling you what they do. So this would seem like a lesson, but it's not one that I think a lot of people have taken to heart because I certainly see a lot of like moralism about behavior.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because one of the arenas where this was an issue was treatment. Okay, no treatment, none of the treatments worked, right? So people had to make their own decisions about what treatments they were going to do, and ACT UP did not tell people which treatments to do. There was a lot of controversy around AZT, which was the highest profit-making pharmaceutical in history and ultimately did not work. And some people feel that some people died because they took it. But ACT UP would never take a position on which treatments a person should take. So that I think is the biggest example.
Right. Yeah. Can I ask Zoe? We have questions in the chat? Yes. Do you want a mic and we can?
So Zoe has compiled the questions. So the first question is, when it should I come up closer or?
Yeah, let's just do let's do one question at a time, I guess.
Yeah, one
and
question
then
at a time.
we'll go down the list.
Perfect. So there's first off, when it's time I'm wondering how Sarah and Jim handled rapidly changing archive formats in the late 20th, early 21st century. Where is the archive safe now, digitally and physically?
So when we started, video was on cassette, and each cassette was 40 minutes. So we used the first 40 minutes to talk to the person about what their life was like before AIDS, and that was how we began. Ultimately, when to make our film, we had to sell our archive to get the money, for reasons that I explained earlier. So we sold it to the Harvard Library, and we used that money to finish the film. Jim is now 70, and I'm 63, so we now have found a younger person who we've explained the whole thing to, so that if he and I both die tomorrow, there will be somebody who knows how to update the website and all of that.
Okay, thank you. The second question, I I'm curious as to how Sarah thinks that we can best combat the pacification, commercialization of queerness.
I'm thinking about this so much these days. You know, it's funny because one of the reasons I think that there's so much interest in the 80s is because queer culture is so dysfunctional and has been so assimilated in really negative ways. And I don't even understand the phrase LGBT because each of those letters is having such a completely different experience. I don't even get anymore how it all relates exactly. I think that the upside is that when you look at the radical movements in our country right now, you know, the movement against police violence, the movement against incarceration, movement for Black lives, Palestine solidarity, all of these movements now have queer and trans people involved in leadership. And so in a way you could say that the radical queer movement lives in these other movements. On the other hand, there's all this backlash. So it really depends on where you live geographically as to what your condition is. And also it's very hard for us to communicate without using corporate culture at this point. You know, originally these newspapers that I started with, the straight people didn't care about them. We were the only ones who read them. Now we find out about ourselves by watching television or by going online, and we are not creating the information that we're consuming about ourselves. I mean, one of the lessons of this book for me is that it's very, very hard to find out how an activist movement functioned. And you can't rely on mainstream cultural coverage to get an accurate view. So right now, we don't even know what's going on right now. Like, there are movements against police violence in every city in this country with local leaders whose names we don't know, who are working with or against municipalities, who have concrete demands, and I don't know what they are. And it's like, it's invisible, I feel. You know, what is the true state of the resistance right now? I think it's very murky for us to even begin to understand.
So the next question is, ACT UP is a great example of organizing for your, quote, own community, but what is the best way to do solidarity organizing or in other ways support others in social positions that are much worse off than you, or aren't directly connected to you? For example, HIV in the Global South or something, or is that a bad idea to pursue?
Can I leap in here? I know that Sarah will have, I'm sure, like a lot to say about this. I do think that I really reject the premise of that question about like the historical premise. There's a point in United in Anger where Maxine Wolf, who's someone who we've talked about a lot, who was a very important leader in the organization, ran the Women's Caucus, was really instrumental with the campaign to change the CDC definition of AIDS. There's this point in the documentary where she like looks at the camera and she says, you know, everyone says white gay men this, white gay men that. In the campaign to change the CDC definition of AIDS, many of the people who worked on it, not all, but many, were gay men who were not going to benefit directly from this change. And that stood out to me. I've seen this documentary many times, but it was when I showed it to my students last term, and I had them write journal responses. I was like, write me one thing that surprised you here. And they all talked about that. Like fully 5/6 of my responses were about that comment. And so that I think that's just like really remarkable in terms of like the frankly false ways that people think about this movement and talk about this movement, although there is like now there's like no excuse. I think you can do your homework a little bit better because there are like the resources to understand that this is not true. So thank you for letting me editorialize.
So, like right now, I mean, I'm associated with Palestine Solidarity, and I'm on the advisory board of Jewish Voice for Peace, and I'm faculty advisor to Students for Justice in Palestine. So this is something that I'm thinking about all the time. And, you know, basically all I can say is you have to listen to the constituency that you're trying to support and see what they want you to do. I mean, the invention of boycott, divestment, sanctions strategy was a brilliant strategy because it gives internationals something concrete to do. Like, we know what we're supposed to do. We know what people think would be helpful for us to do that would support their movement. BDS. That's why there's all these anti-BDS things going on all over the world, because it's effective. So, you know, when you're in solidarity with a movement that's so proactive and so clear about what they want, you know, I think it makes it easier for us to be in solidarity without trying to seize the discourse.
Can I get a time check?
Yeah, so it's, I believe, 8:16 p.m.
Okay, cool. So we have 14 more minutes. Can I, are there more questions from the personal audience? Yes, Alexandra. And then in the front.
Disagreements are also fine, too.
Great talk so far. So listening to this, I was really interested to listen to you talk about the extent to which people were able to vote with their feet about what work they wanted to do in ACT UP, because I think that's actually quite different than the way DSA tends to talk about how we should do things in DSA. There's often a lot of push to like pick a couple of things and focus on them so you can be more effective. And in my experience, this means people who don't want to do those things often just kind of drop off by the side of the road, which is a problem. But I'm wondering whether on the other side, like, were there times at ACT UP where a lack of focus actually caused problems for advancing the bigger cause?
Well, at the end, it was quite a kind of chaotic. I mean, once you realize that AIDS reveals the fissures of the society, right? And that ultimately it was a disease of poverty and inequality. And then your answer becomes equality, then you've got a different kind of movement. So, you know, I mean, looking at it, this is my personal view, that looking at the American history, you can see that there's a trajectory for utopian movements and there's a trajectory for reform movements, right? So you have like utopian socialists, anarchists in the 1920s, American communism, the hippie movement, gay liberation, those are like utopian movements. And then you have reform movements like ending slavery, women voting, making abortion legal, AIDS activism, you know, and I think that we move forward when both movements are alive and well and are in a dynamic relationship to each other. Because then we have concrete demands for things that people really need to make their lives better, but we also have a bigger vision of what we want. And in queer politics, when there was gay liberation and gay rights, it was much more dynamic and culturally more advanced. But you know, after AIDS, after the epicenter of AIDS, it became a gay rights movement, and the liberation part disappeared, and that's when you get all the co-optation and everything. So you know, that's the tension, is between the big vision and the immediate needs, and maybe one organization can hold all of that. I'm not really sure. I don't know what the conclusion is, but that's my observation.
Right in the front.
Okay.
Amazing, great. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Thanks. Just out of curiosity, could you tell us a little bit, maybe briefly, about the New Alliance Party?
So they came out of Lyndon LaRouche, if you remember him. And they had a woman leader, I forget her name right now. Anybody remember? She ran for mayor. No, anyway, they were a cult, basically. And what? Fred Newman was part of the Lyndon LaRouche group. This was the second generation when it was called the New Alliance Party. So they came in as a group, and they acted as a unit. They were disciplined. So they would all say the same thing, and then they would all vote for the same thing, and they tried to take over ACT UP. So we had to be like, no. You know, and that's what happened there. Lenore Fulani, that was her name. Lenore.
Can we do in the back here and then see if there are more questions online?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I guess, I know you said like there was already things that connected you unintentionally as community to be able to, I'm wondering like what things did you practice intentionally to deepen those relationships amongst each other?
There was nothing that was official. It was all unofficial. There was no like consciousness raising. There were no study groups. There was nothing that was theoretical in any way. Every single thing was action oriented because so many people in the group were sick and dying and they needed things right away. And all the other things were inadvertent.
Are there, oh yeah, actually let's hear right here and then.
Thank you so much. You had mentioned before that nobody really knew the full scope of the organization at the time, and I guess that probably included you at the time. Do you feel like your memory of it retrospectively changed while working on the movie and the book and the oral history project? And also, kind of related to that question, what was it like to work on something so personal to your own life?
Okay, thank you. I just want to correct myself when I said there were no study groups. The science people were always studying science, and they were studying the drugs, but there was no theory study groups. Okay, let's see. So when Jim and I started interviewing people in 2001, we realized right away that everyone in ACT UP only knew what they themselves did, and that we were the same. And the more people we interviewed, the more we realized that so much, there were things that were major things going on that I had never heard of. I mean, major, major campaigns. And that was true for everybody. I mean, there's no one, absolutely no one knew what was going on. So I conducted all but 2 of the interviews over 18 years. So because there was one interviewer, and Jim and I would reassess after each interview, like what new things did we just find out? What do we need coverage of? You know, what do we now? How does this connect to that thing? Like we were conceptualizing the whole thing for 2 decades. And then when I had to write the book is when I had to put it all together. So I started rereading the interviews, and the first thing I realized was that it couldn't be chronological because it wouldn't be accurate because so much was happening at the same time. Now, fortunately, I've already had a whole life experience as a novelist, so I had a lot of experience with form. And just in terms of myself as an artist, I've always felt that form should come organically from content, not the other way around. So I came up with the form that I felt would be most accurate to the history, which was to use tropes instead of like, chronology. So like there's some chapters that are just about one event. There's some chapters that are about certain milieu, like the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, for example. There's some chapters that are about issues like homelessness, or there's one about like how ACT UP made money, for example. I have a chapter on that. So by cohering these tropes and then putting them together, I hoped that it would resonate in a larger way to try to convey the experience a little bit better, and I do feel that that worked. The thing is, I've been in AIDS since AIDS started, and it's not even my major thing. Like, my main thing is that I write lesbian novels. This is like a sidebar, but it's just that when AIDS started and when I started, most of the people who started with me are not alive anymore. I mean, some of them are, but there's very few of us who have the whole view. So there's an incredible sense of responsibility. I don't even know how to convey that. You just feel like if we didn't do this, all those people, everything they did would have been forgotten. And a lot of these people were forgotten. They were deliberately forgotten. I mean, their families forgot them, or entire friendship groups died. And, so Jim and I have taken this all very seriously. Now, the thing is, I've never had a time where I wasn't doing this. So in a way, like, I haven't ever, I guess on some level, dealt with it or whatever. It's been ongoing. And I talk about it all the time. Like, I was just in England, and I spoke to a group of 150 women with HIV. And that was, like, incredible. I mean, there were other people there, too, but it was just, like, this huge, and it was, like, amazing. So it's been an incredible opportunity to meet people who are, changing the world and changing their own lives all the time. I mean, it's a phenomenal movement the movement of people with HIV in the world, and it's very inspiring. But that's how I've dealt with it. The other thing is just personally, I come from a Holocaust family, and I'm sure that that's a huge part of this. And Jim is also Jewish, and we're, he's older than me. I was born in 1958, so we were born within memory time of the end of the Holocaust. And, we were very much indoctrinated with this thing about memory and tell your story and all of that stuff. So I'm sure that has a huge impact on all of this, but I haven't pulled all that apart yet.
Can we, let's do this one hand here and then see what questions, if there are more questions online. And I feel like we probably have 7 minutes left. Am I sort of accurate about that? 5, great, okay. Yeah, so we probably have time for 2 questions. So right here and then one online.
Hi, thanks so much. So you said that ACT UP was one of the first video-first organizing movements, and you also said that the archive started 18 years ago, which really means that you guys realized the importance of tech in organizing really, really early on. So I'm so curious to hear how you realized the importance of technology so early on and how you've seen organizing change within that so far.
Okay, so there was a group of people in ACT UP who had gone to this thing called the Whitney program. Do people know about that? I think it's a non-degree program that was run by the Whitney Museum that had these very theoretically advanced people like Yvonne Rainer and stuff like that were the teachers. I mean, it's actually something I haven't totally delved into, but it was like Greg Bordowitz, Alex Uhas, some pretty significant people in ACT UP went through this training. And this thing, because it was a cutting edge art thing, was very video sophisticated. So they came out of it with video consciousness. And those became some of them are still video artists today. So that was an intersection there. But there also were video activists in ACT UP who had no training whatsoever. One of the guys that I interviewed was a cleaner in a gay bar, George Plaginos, and he had the worst camera in ACT UP, and he couldn't edit. So he only had what he shot, and I interviewed him about that. So, and then, when like I said, we did the oral history project because we knew that we needed to create digitized material because nobody knew anything about what ACT UP had done. It was like it had disappeared.
Yeah, please.
What advice do you have for media makers, filmmakers who are interested in continuing in your tradition and would like to make work about the history and lessons from ACT UP and other radical social movements?
Do it. I don't know. I don't have any advice. You have to just do things. I'm sorry. I don't know. I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer than that, but that's all I have, really. Maybe we should end on that.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
I love that.
Thank you.
I love that. Yeah, give it up. I see you guys standing. I would stand too. Can I stand on the stage? I'm gonna do that. Sarah, thank you so much. Wow. I'm so grateful, and I'm grateful to everyone who came and brought their curiosity and their questions. I believe that there is a plan to go to a bar afterwards. I'm making eyes at Elliot, who I think has a suggestion of where to go. And then if you want to sign up for Queer Caucus, also see Elliot. And beyond that, I think maybe we can just say thank you once again to the People's Forum for hosting us. Thank you to Queer Caucus and the Healthcare Working Group. And also, this is like a chapter-wide event. So thank you to folks on steering for approving this event. Appreciate it. Giving us the Zoom. Tiffany, who helped me so much with all the admin. I think that's everything and everybody. If I'm forgetting you, I'm sorry, but I'm grateful to the bottom of my heart. And I'll pass the mic to Elliot and we'll say goodnight.
Thank you. Thank you, Kay. And thank you also to the People's Forum for hosting us tonight. Very smooth Zoom things happening, very impressive. Like DSA has been trying to do hybrid things, and this is by far the smoothest that I've seen. So thank you, People's Forum. So we're gonna go to the District Tap House, which is a 3-minute walk. It's not a gay bar, but it's really cold, and so we opted for the closest thing. But yeah, we'll take it over. It's on 38th between 7th and 8th Avenues. It's a 3-minute walk from here. So hope to continue the conversation over there. And then again, like Kay said, if you do want to join the New York City DSA Queer Caucus mailing list, there's a clipboard right here, and we'll make sure you get info about our events. So thanks again.
Good night.